Now, let's talk about history of the development of uloom al-Qur'an and tafsir. We're going to be looking at it more from a uloom al-Qur'an point of view, because this is looking at uloom al-Qur'an approaches tafsir from a theoretical point of view. If you see that there's been a tendency to look at matters on a juz'i, looking at the trees rather than the forest approach, to a lot of knowledge, types of knowledge, and then eventually people, they've studied all the trees and they start to look at the broader patterns. So when it comes to uloom al-Qur'an, in the 2nd century Christian era, not Christian era, the 8th century Christian era, which would be the 2nd century Hijri era, you have scholars like Shu'ba ibn al-Hajjaj, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Waqi' ibn al-Jarrah. They compiled books of tafsir, which were ma'thur collections. They were all narrations from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een as to what particular verses meant. And some of those narrations would have been attributed to the Prophet ﷺ as well. In the 3rd century after the Hijrah, you have Ali ibn al-Madini. He did a book on Asbab al-Nuzul. Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, he was from the 3rd century also. He did a book on al-Nasikh wal-Mansukh, abrogating and abrogated verses. He also did a book on Gharib al-Qur'an. He was one of those towering scholars. He did a lot in many different fields. And then in the 3rd century, he died in 310 AH. Of course, we have Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, who wrote what is perhaps the single most important tafsir in history. He took those narrations. It's an encyclopedia of tafsir. He took all these narrations from the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and perhaps the Atba' Tabi'een, as to what these verses and passages meant, and then he organized them thematically. There's on this passage there's 2 or 3 opinions. He'll mention what the opinions about what they meant, and then he'll give you with the isnads who said what, and then he'll also he sifted through those statements, and he gave he mentioned the qira'at. He gave also what he considered to be the weightiest opinion, and so he really did a work that was combination of tafsir by athar and tafsir bil ra'i. And then you have Abu Bakr al-Sijistani in the 4th century. He did a book on Gharib al-Hadith. Ali ibn Sa'id al-Hufi in the 5th century did a book on particularly difficult i'rab constructions, the grammatical constructions. Abdurrahman al-Sabili, he did a book on the mubhamat of the Quran, things which are ambiguous wordings. Ibn Abdus Salam did, in the 7th century, did a work on the majaz aspects of the Quran, metaphorical usages. Alam ad-Din al-Sakhawi in the 7th century did a book on qira'at. Other scholars did books on aqsam, the oaths of the Quran, and the amthal, metaphors and similes. And if you look at all of these, the methodology of them across the board was to look at the Quran from a particular angle and then look at the verse by verse manifestations of that particular angle of interest. And now there's a book that al-Zarqani called al-Burhan fi uloom al-Qur'aan, which sounds like it would have been a really early book that would deal with uloom al-Qur'aan in some kind of overview fashion. Now, according to Dr. Phillips, and I'm sure he's quoting Manal al-Qattan in that, that was a Zarqani misquoted the title of this book, that it should actually be al-Burhan fi TAFSIIR al-Qur'aan. And that's what it really is. This was done by a man named Ali ibn Ibrahim ibn Sa'id al-Hufi, who died in 330 AH. And he does bring all of these different kind of aspects of uloom al-Qur'an to bear on tafsir, but he does it in that standard verse-by-verse treatment. It was originally a 30-volume work. 15 volumes of it are still existing in manuscript form. They're in one of the depositories, the libraries in Egypt. But then in the 6th century, you start to see these thematic treatments of uloom al-Qur'an. Ibn al-Jawzi, the famous Hanbali scholar who died in 595 AH, he did 2 books on that. One of them has been published. It's called Funun al-Afnan fi uloom al-Qur'an. I've never looked at it. Badruddin al-Zarkashi, the great scholar. This is another one like an-Nawawi. He was also a Shafi scholar. He died at the age of 40, I think. If it wasn't 40, it was in his 40s. And he produced a tremendous amount of scholarly work, including al-Bahr al-Muhit fi Usool al-Fiqh and al-Burhan fi uloom al-Qur'an. That's considered one of the groundbreaking works in this field. And then Jalaluddin al-Bulqini in the 9th century, he did Mawaqi' al-Uloom min Mawaqi' al-Nujum. That was also, he broke some ground on this kind of overview of the Qur'an. But the main work on the field is considered to be as-Suyuti's al-Itqan fi uloom al-Qur'an. As-Suyuti Abdurrahman Suyuti died 911 after the Hijrah. He identified about 100 topics related to uloom al-Qur'an, and then he dealt with them in detail. Now, he did rely quite a lot on al-Zarkashi's book, but it's, he added a lot that Zarkashi didn't have. When we look at the 20th century, I mean, there are 2 that are they stand out from all the other works as far as people's usage of them. Muhammad Abdul Adim al-Zarqani, he was an Azhari scholar from the first half of the 20th century, Christian era or Common Era. He did Manahilul Irfan fi uloom al-Qur'an, and that's published as a 2 slim volumes, and I'm going to rely on that pretty heavily in this course. And Manal al-Qattan, al-Mabahith fi uloom al-Qur'an, which Dr. Phillips relied on heavily in his Usool al-Tafseer. So that is an introduction then to our course. I'd just like to mention some of the topics that we'll be dealing with: the nature of revelation, the uniqueness of the Qur'an, the methodology of tafsir, asbab al-nuzul, naskh, the Meccan and Medinan revelations and the language of the Qur'an. We'll talk about the meanings of Quranic terminologies, the am and the khas, the general and the specific, the mutlaq and muqayyad, the unrestricted and the restricted, haqiqa and majaz, similes and metaphors, stories of the Qur'an. Now, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of that's overlapping with usool al-fiqh, so we'll try to bring out aspects of it that were not dealt with in detail in the usool, at least in my usool course. And then we'll take the second half of the course. We'll be looking at types of tafsir. Tafsir bil-ma'thur, we'll look at specific tafsirs. We'll talk about these as methodologies, and then we'll look at specific tafsirs. Like there's a recently published Marwiyat al-Imam Ahmad, the tafsir, and of course at-Tabari and Ibn Kathir, and the Suyuti's Durr al-Manthur. We'll look at specific verses and see how each of them treat this. Also important for that, Ibn al-Jawzi's Zad al-Masir, which is considered a tafsir al-ma'thur, although it has, like most, it has some ra'i aspects to it. As far as tafsir bil-ra'i, we'll look at al-Razi's Mafatih al-Ghaib, also known as Tafsir al-Kabir, and Zamakhshari's al-Kashaf. Actually, Zamakhshari came earlier, so probably look at him first. And Ibn Ashur, 20th century Tunisian scholar, one of the great scholars of the last century, really towering scholar, and his tafsir, al-Tahrir wa Tanwir, is also, it's just a magnificent tafsir. We'll look at that. And the fiqh tafsirs, such as Ahkam al-Qur'an of al-Jassas and of Ibn al-Arabi, al-Maliki, and we'll look at also the Shafi work, major Shafi work on that. Tafsir al-Ishari, that's a sort of a looser form of tafsir associated with Sufis. Ruh al-Ma'ani of Alusi is considered a major tafsir of that type. We'll look at that. We'll also look at some of the other tafsirs that are considered to be Sufi. The one that's attributed to Ibn al-Arabi as Sufi, we'll look at that, inshallah, and some of the Shiite tafsirs. We'll also look at the coherence school. You have al-Biqa'i, who tried to deal with the munasabat, and why is this verse here related to the other verses? Why is this surah here related to the other verses in that order? And then you have this whole school of the Indian scholars of the last century or two, al-Islahi, al-Farrahi, and then his students, Mustansir Mir, Israr Ahmad, where they really try to focus on the coherence of the Quran. What's the theme of a surah, and how do all the sections of a surah relate to that common theme? And also, we'll try to look at what Ash-Shatibi had to say about thematic approach to tafsir of the Quran. And one of the people that sort of took that and tried to work on it in greater detail, Darraz, Muhammad ibn Abdullah Darraz, who was the son of the man who did the commentary on Shatibi's al-Muwafaqat. And Fazl Rahman is a modernist and modern Pakistani scholar who did a book on a thematic approach to the Quran. And since we're talking about Fazl Rahman, we'll talk about some of the modernist tafsirs or approaches to tafsir. The contextualists is another name for them. Fazl Rahman, Nasr Abu Zaid, who was run out of Egypt for some people considered him to have become an apostate. Khalid Abul Fadl, Amin al-Wadud, Muhammad Arkud. Some of these people will take a look at some of what they have to say. And also, we'll take a look in detail at Adwa al-Bayan. Inshallah, God willing. I mean, this is a lot of stuff to cover, but hopefully we'll get most of it taken care of. and Allah is wali al-tawfiq. He is the one who gives ability, and Allah knows best. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.